If you walked into any transmission shop in 1972 and asked about the fastest street cars in town, you would have gotten a lot of different answers. Someone in Detroit might have told you about a Hemi Cuda that destroyed everything at Woodward Avenue, while a guy in Los Angeles could have sworn he saw a 442 Oldsmobile that ran low 12s all day long. Speed was everywhere, and muscle cars were the kings of the street. But there was something happening in garages across America that most people didn't know about. Something that didn't involve camshafts or carburetors or cubic inches. We are talking about a tiny aluminum part that cost $12, weighed less than a can of soda, and could turn your grandmother's Buick into a street monster that would embarrass cars twice its price. This is the story of the TH400 Governor, the forgotten hero of General Motors performance, and the underground tuning secret that created some of the most unlikely street legends of the muscle car era. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with automatic transmissions and how they work, here's what you need to know. Unlike a manual transmission where the driver decides when to shift gears, an automatic transmission has to figure out when to shift all by itself. In the early days of automatic transmissions, this was done with a complex system of hydraulics and springs and vacuum lines that tried to guess when you wanted to shift based on engine load and throttle position. But General Motors in the 1960s had a better idea. They created a device called a governor, and this little mechanical genius changed everything about how automatic transmissions worked, and more importantly, how they could be modified to go faster. The governor itself was deceptively simple. Picture a small aluminum housing about the size of a hockey puck that bolted onto the output shaft of the transmission. Inside this housing were a set of weights connected to springs, and as the transmission output shaft spun faster, centrifugal force would pull these weights outward against the spring pressure. This movement would open and close hydraulic passages inside the governor body, and these passages controlled the flow of transmission fluid to the shift valves. The faster the output shaft spun, the more the weights moved and the higher the hydraulic pressure became. When that pressure reached a certain point, boom, the transmission would automatically shift to the next gear. It was elegant engineering, pure mechanical simplicity that worked without electronics or computers or anything fancy. But here is where things get interesting. General Motors used essentially the same TH400 transmission in everything from grocery-getting Buick Skylarks to fire-breathing Chevelles SS models with 454 cubic inch big blocks under the hood. The transmission case was the same. The gear sets were similar. The torque converter varied a bit, but you know what part was almost always identical? The governor. That same little aluminum housing with the same weights and the same springs went into nearly every TH400 that rolled off the assembly line, regardless of what engine sat in front of it. Now you might be thinking, well, that makes sense. Why would they need different governors? Here is why this was such a big deal. A stock Buick Skylark with a small block 350 making maybe 260 horsepower was designed to shift early and often to maximize fuel economy and provide smooth, comfortable acceleration for daily driving. The governor was calibrated to shift at relatively low speeds, maybe 4,000 RPM in first gear and 4,500 in second gear. This worked great for normal driving, but what happened when someone took that exact same transmission and bolted it behind a 454 big block making 450 horsepower? The transmission still shifted at those same low RPM points, which meant that massive engine never got to stretch its legs and make full power. Think about it this way. Imagine you have got this monster motor that makes peak horsepower at 5,500 RPM, but your transmission keeps shifting at 4,500 RPM. You are leaving 1,000 RPM of power on the table every single time you shift. That 454 that should be making 450 horsepower is effectively making maybe 380 because it never gets into its power band. It was like putting a muzzle on a guard dog. Sure, it still worked, but you were missing out on everything that made it special. The hot rodders and drag racers of the 1960s figured this out pretty quickly. They noticed that cars with 4-speed manual transmissions, where the driver could hold each gear longer, were consistently faster than identical cars with automatics. And they knew it was not because automatics were inherently slower. Automatics actually shifted faster than any human could row through a manual transmission. The problem was those early shift points that were killing their elapsed times at the drag strip. So they started looking at that governor. They pulled it off the transmission, took it apart on their workbenches, and started measuring and weighing and thinking. The whole system was based on centrifugal force and spring tension. The heavier the weights, the more force they generated at any given RPM. The stiffer the springs, the more force was needed to compress them and trigger a shift. It was basic physics, the kind of stuff you could figure out with a pencil and paper, and some trial and error. The first experiments were crude but effective. Some guys would carefully grind material off the governor weights to make them lighter. Less weight meant less centrifugal force at low RPM, which meant the transmission would not shift until the engine was spinning faster. Others would swap in stiffer springs from hardware stores or even other GM transmissions, increasing the force needed to open the hydraulic passages. Both methods achieved the same goal, delaying the shift points and letting the engine rev higher before each gear change. And the beauty of it was that this modification cost almost nothing. You could pull a governor off a junkyard transmission for $5, swap the springs for another couple of dollars, maybe spend a few hours with a file and a scale trimming the weights, and suddenly, your car was running half a second quicker in the quarter mile. For guys who were spending hundreds or thousands of dollars on headers and carburetors and cylinder heads, this was an absolute revelation. $12 in an afternoon in the garage could unlock more performance than parts that cost 10 times as much. But it gets even better. Because the governor was such a simple mechanical device, the modifications were completely reversible. If you went too far and made the transmission shift too late, or if you wanted to put it back to stock for daily driving or to pass an inspection, you just swap the governor back to the original one. No cutting, no welding, no permanent changes to the car. You could have two governors sitting on a shelf, one for street driving and one for racing, and swap between them in 20 minutes. Try doing that with a camshaft or a set of cylinder heads. This underground knowledge spread through the racing community like wildfire. Transmission shops started offering modified governors as over-the-counter parts. Magazine tech articles would casually mention governor modifications in their build stories. Drag racers would share spring part numbers and weight specifications in the pits. And the really clever guys started to realize that you could tune a governor as precisely as you could tune a carburetor. Different weight combinations would shift at different points in the RPM range. Different spring rates would change how aggressive the shifts felt. You could make a transmission shift like a sledgehammer, bang, bang, bang through the gears with tire-smoking force, or you could make it shift smooth as silk but still hold each gear to redline. It all depended on how you set up that little aluminum housing and what components you put inside it. And here is where the sleeper car phenomenon really took off. See, in the 1960s and early 70s, insurance companies were hammering young drivers with massive premiums if they owned a muscle car. A Chevelle SS or a GTO could cost you 3 or 4 times as much to insure as a base model sedan, even if both cars had the same engine. So smart buyers started ordering plain Jane cars with big engines hidden under the hood. A Buick GS without the fancy badges, a Pontiac Catalina instead of a GTO, a Chevrolet Biscayne with a 427 instead of a Chevelle SS. These cars looked like your dad's grocery getter, but they had serious power under the skin. The problem was that even with a big engine, these sleeper cars came with the same automatic transmission calibration as the genuine Granny Mobile versions. Factory engineers were not going to set up a base model Impala to shift at 6,000 RPM just because someone checked the option box for a bigger motor. So these sleepers left the factory with all that power neutered by conservative shift points. Enter our $12 hero. A modified governor turned these sleepers into absolute street terrors. Picture this. You are sitting at a stoplight in your pristine Chevelle SS with racing stripes and hood scoops, and every badge that Chevrolet made, and next to you pulls up what looks like a bone stock Biscayne wagon with hubcaps and a vinyl bench seat. The light turns green. You hammer the throttle, and for the first 50 feet you are ahead because your car shifts hard and grabs traction. But then something happens. That boring station wagon just keeps pulling and pulling and pulling. First gear screams to 6 grand. Perfect shift into second. Engine still howling like a banshee. Second gear pulls to 5,800 RPM. Another lightning quick shift. And by the time you are both doing 80 miles per hour, that wagon is 3 car lengths ahead, and you are left sitting there wondering what just happened. What happened was that somebody spent $12 in an afternoon with a file, While you were paying for expensive valve covers and chrome air cleaners to make your car look fast, that guy made his actually go fast by fixing the one thing that was holding it back. And the best part? Nobody knew. The car looked completely stock. Even if you popped the hood, you would see a stock air cleaner and stock valve covers, and maybe wonder if it had a bigger cam, but you would never guess that the real secret was buried inside the transmission, where nobody thought to look. This is exactly what happened to countless street racers in that era. They would get smoked by some plain-looking Oldsmobile or Pontiac and spend the next week trying to figure out what kind of secret engine build it had, never realizing that the engine was probably bone stock and all the magic was happening in the transmission. The Governor modification became the secret handshake of the underground performance scene. If you knew, you knew. And if you did not know, you were going to keep losing races to cars that had no business being that fast. The modifications got more sophisticated as time went on. Guys started documenting exactly which combinations work best for different applications. If you had a big block Chevy making peak power at 5,800 RPM, you wanted the Governor to shift at about 6,200 in first and second gear to account for the RPM drop during the shift. If you had a small block that peaked at 6,500, you would calibrate differently. Some transmission builders even started machining custom weights from billet aluminum or steel to achieve exact specifications that were impossible with grinding alone. And then the really wild part happened. People started realizing that you could use different Governor setups for different types of racing. A drag racing Governor would be set up to hold each gear as long as possible, maximizing acceleration in a straight line. But a street racing Governor might shift a bit earlier to keep the engine in its sweet spot for repeated pulls without over-revving. Some guys even had multiple Governors for the same car, depending on whether they were racing from a dig or from a roll, whether they were at sea level or in the mountains, whether they had traction or were spinning the tires. It became an art form, this Governor tuning business. The really good transmission guys could drive a car once and tell you exactly what needed to change in the Governor to make it quicker. Too much weight, not enough spring, wrong combination of both. They could feel it in how the car shifted, in where the RPM was when the next gear grabbed, in whether the engine was happy or complaining. And because it was such a cheap and easy modification, they could make changes between runs at the drag strip, constantly chasing that perfect setup. But here is what made the TH400 Governor such a legendary modification in the muscle car world. It worked on everything. It did not matter if you had a Chevy, a Pontiac, a Buick, or an Oldsmobile. It did not matter if you had a small block or a big block or even one of those weird Buick V6s. If your car had a TH400 transmission, and most GM performance cars of that era did, then you could benefit from a modified Governor. It was the great equalizer, the one modification that every General Motors owner could use regardless of what kind of car they drove. And unlike so many other performance modifications of that era, Governor tuning did not hurt reliability. In fact, in some ways, it improved it. See, when a transmission shifts too early under heavy throttle, it loads up the clutch packs and bands with tons of torque at low RPM. This creates heat and wear, and eventually leads to failure. But when you let the engine rev higher before shifting, the shift happens at a point where the engine is making more power, and the whole process is actually smoother and easier on the transmission components. Guys who properly tuned their Governors often found that their transmissions lasted longer than stock, not shorter. The other beautiful thing about Governor modifications was that they worked in combination with other modifications. If you added a bigger camshaft that moved your power band higher, you could retune the Governor to match. If you swapped to a looser torque converter that let the engine flash to a higher stall speed, you could adjust the Governor to complement that change. It was the ultimate supporting modification, something that made everything else work better without overshadowing the main event. Of course, like anything in the performance world, some people took it too far. There were always guys who thought that if shifting at 6,500 RPM was good, then shifting at 7,000 must be better. They would file too much weight off the Governor, or install springs that were way too stiff, and then wonder why their engine would over-rev and float the valves, or why their transmission would slip because the shift was happening at such high RPM that the clutches could not handle it. But those cautionary tales just reinforced the knowledge among the people who knew what they were doing. Governor tuning was a precision art, not a sledgehammer approach. By the mid-1970s, The muscle car era was winding down. Insurance rates had killed off most of the high-performance options. Emission controls were strangling engines, and fuel economy became the watchword of the day. But the Governor modification lived on in the underground street racing scene. Those plain-looking sedans and wagons with modified Governors became even more valuable as sleepers because nobody expected them to be fast anymore. A 1974 Chevrolet Impala with a 400 small block and a tuned Governor could absolutely destroy a brand new sports car from the late 70s, and nobody would see it coming. The knowledge got passed down through generations of hot rodders. Fathers taught sons, transmission builders taught apprentices, and the internet eventually made this information available to anyone who knew where to look. And even though electronic transmissions eventually replaced the old TH400 in modern cars, those classic muscle cars with their mechanical Governors are still out there, still being raced, still being tuned. Today, you can find guys who combine old-school Governor tuning with modern technology. They use digital tachometers and data logging systems to precisely measure shift points. They 3D print custom Governor, weights with exact specifications. They run computer simulations to model how different spring rates will affect shift feel and timing. But at the core, they are still doing the same thing that hot rodders were doing 50 years ago, manipulating centrifugal force and spring tension to make their cars faster. And the beauty of it is that the modification still costs almost nothing compared to other performance upgrades. You can buy a remanufactured Governor online for $30. A set of performance springs might cost another $20. An afternoon in your garage with basic hand tools and you are done. Meanwhile, a modern engine computer tune for a new car costs $500 or more, and you cannot even do it yourself without special equipment. The TH400 Governor modification is a reminder of a time when performance was accessible to anyone who was willing to learn and willing to work. There is something poetic about the fact that this little aluminum housing became such a legend in automotive history. It was not exotic, it was not expensive, it was not even particularly complicated, but it was effective. It democratized performance in a way that few other modifications ever did. Rich or poor, experienced or novice, if you had a TH400 and you had $12, you could make your car faster. That is the kind of simple, honest engineering that built the muscle car era in the first place. The stories from that era are the stuff of legend. There was a guy in Chicago who had a 1968 Buick Electra two-door that nobody took seriously until he smoked a brand new Corvette at a traffic light. The Corvette owner was so confused, he followed the Buick to a gas station and demanded to know what kind of engine was in it. When the Buick owner popped the hood and showed him a bone stock 430 with factory exhaust manifolds and a 2-barrel carburetor, the Corvette guy just shook his head and walked away. He never figured out that the secret was in the transmission. Or the guy in Southern California who would cruise Van Nuys Boulevard in a completely stock-looking Pontiac Catalina station wagon with wood grain paneling on the sides and a luggage rack on top. That wagon had a 465 under the hood, but more importantly, it had a Governor that had been meticulously tuned to shift at exactly 6200 RPM in every gear. He would pull up next to muscle cars at stoplights, and they would laugh at the family wagon. Then the light would change, and that wagon would absolutely destroy them, wood paneling and all. The look on their faces was priceless every single time. These sleepers became urban legends in their own right. Every city had stories about the mysterious taxi cab with a 454, or the mail delivery truck that could run 13s, or the police car that was secretly faster than anything on the street. And while some of those stories were exaggerated or completely made up, many of them were absolutely true, because when you had a modified Governor and a big block, you could make any car fast. It did not matter what it looked like on the outside. The Governor modification also created an interesting dynamic at drag strips across the country. In the stock and super stock classes, cars were supposed to be relatively unmodified from how they came from the factory. But the rules were written by people who understood engines and carburetors and exhaust systems. Nobody thought to write specific rules about Governors because they were just considered part of the transmission. So guys would show up with completely stock-appearing cars that had modified Governors, and they would dominate their classes because they were getting an extra 1,000 RPM out of every gear while staying within the letter of the rules. This led to some hilarious situations where tech inspectors would tear apart a car looking for illegal modifications. They would measure the carburetor, check the camshaft, verify the cylinder heads, inspect the exhaust system, and find absolutely nothing wrong. Meanwhile, the real secret was sitting in the transmission pan, and nobody ever thought to check it. By the time the sanctioning bodies caught on and started writing rules about governors, the cat was already out of the bag. Everyone knew how to do it, and trying to police it became nearly impossible. The aftermarket also jumped on the governor bandwagon in a big way. Companies like B&M, TCI, and Transgo started selling performance governors and modification kits. These kits would include different weight sets, different springs, and detailed instructions on how to calibrate everything for your specific application. Some of the high-end kits even included multiple sets of components, so you could experiment and find the perfect setup for your car. Transgo, in particular, became famous for their shift kits that included governor modifications, along with valve body changes and other internal transmission upgrades. Their kits were so popular that having a Transgo shift kit in your TH400 became a badge of honor in the street racing community. It meant you were serious about going fast and you had taken the time to properly set up your transmission. But even with all the commercial kits available, the real masters of governor tuning were the old-school transmission builders who did everything by feel and experience. These guys could look at a governor, weigh it in their hand, and tell you within 100 RPM where it was going to shift. They could listen to a car go down the street and know exactly what needed to be changed to make it quicker. Their knowledge was not written down in any manual or specification sheet. It lived in their heads and their hands, passed down through years of trial and error and late nights in the shop. Some of these transmission builders became legends in their own right. There was a guy in Detroit who could build you a TH400 that would shift so hard it felt like you got rear-ended, but it would never break. There was a builder in Texas who specialized in high RPM governors for road racing applications, setting them up to shift at 7,000 RPM all day long without any issues. And there was a shop in New Jersey that became famous for building governors that would shift differently depending on throttle position, giving you soft shifts for cruising and hard shifts for racing, all from the same governor setup. The technical sophistication of some of these builds was really impressive when you think about it. Remember, this was all being done with purely mechanical components in an era before computer modeling or electronic sensors. Everything was based on understanding the physics of centrifugal force and spring rates and hydraulic pressure. The fact that these guys could tune a governor to shift within 100 RPM of their target, using nothing but hand tools and experience, is a testament to the mechanical expertise of that generation of hot rodders. And the modifications were not just limited to changing shift points either. Really advanced builders started playing with the governor to change shift quality and firmness. By adjusting how quickly the weights moved, they could control how fast the hydraulic pressure built up, which in turn controlled how aggressively the transmission shifted. A governor set up for drag racing might shift in 1/10 of a second with a tire chirping bang. A governor set up for street driving might take 3/10 of a second and shift smooth as butter. Same transmission, same clutch packs, completely different feel just from governor tuning. This level of control was revolutionary for the time. Modern electronic transmissions can do all this and more with computer programming, but back then it was all mechanical. And in some ways, the mechanical system was actually better because it was so simple and reliable. There were no sensors to fail, no computers to glitch, no software to corrupt. Just weights and springs and hydraulic pressure, doing their thing, lap after lap, year after year. The governor modification also had an interesting effect on the used car market. Savvy buyers started specifically looking for plain Jane GM cars with TH400 transmissions because they knew what those cars could become with a simple modification. A boring Oldsmobile Delta 88 with a 455 and a TH400 could be bought for peanuts, and with a modified governor, it would outrun cars that cost 5 times as much. This created a whole subculture of bargain performance, where the goal was not to buy the fastest car, but to buy the car with the most potential. Some of the best street racers of that era were guys who had almost no money, but tons of knowledge. They would find a beat-up Pontiac Bonneville at an auction for $500, spend another $100 on a used governor and some springs, and suddenly they had a car that could hang with the big dogs. Meanwhile, other guys were spending tens of thousands of dollars on Corvettes and Chevelles and still getting beaten by these junkyard specials. It proved that knowledge and skill were more valuable than money, at least when it came to going fast. The psychological aspect of this was brutal for the guys with expensive cars. Imagine spending $15,000 on a pristine Chevelle SS with every option, and then getting destroyed by a ratty-looking Catalina that probably cost a tenth of that. It was humiliating, and the worst part was that you could not even figure out what made the cheap car so fast. The engine sounded stock. The exhaust looked stock. There were no nitrous bottles or blowers sticking out of the hood. The secret was completely invisible, hidden away inside a transmission that you would never think to inspect. This created a lot of paranoia in the street racing scene. Guys started assuming that every plain-looking GM car was a sleeper with a modified governor. They would refuse to race station wagons or four-door sedans because they had been burned too many times. The reputation of these sleepers grew to mythical proportions. Stories would circulate about some guy with a Caprice taxi that was running tens, or a hearse with a 454 that beat a Hemi-Cuda. And while most of these stories were probably exaggerated, the fact that they were believable says everything about what a modified governor could do. So the next time you see a plain-looking General Motors product from the 1960s or 70s, do not judge it by its hubcaps, or its vinyl roof, or its lack of racing stripes. Because somewhere inside that car, behind that Torque converter, and inside that transmission case, there might be a little aluminum governor that has been carefully tuned and modified and adjusted. And that $12 part might be the difference between a nice, old car and a genuine street legend that made muscle car owners question everything they thought they knew about speed.